Nakomi marialuk, amisungi kalok dilawin yung katika. Makuhok do kay. Pingasuyun. Inyo vielo mi mani tuit, malununa mi mani mi mata. I always start in my own mother tongue, which is Inuktitut, and it's wonderful here tonight to have three. There's some from Inuvialuit and Nunavut as well, so I'm very happy to be here. But I also want to say thank you to Ernie Campbell, who spoke before, and who is the Deputy Minister of Environment and Natural Resources for Northwest Territories. Thank you for your words this evening. And I also want to acknowledge the fact that I'm on the land of the Yellowknives within the Akecho territory. So it's great to be here. And there's a colleague from the Arctic Inspirational Prize Committee that we met a week ago or so in Ottawa, I think it is. And I'll plug in that because there hasn't been enough applicants. So think about that for next year, folks, whoever is in here working on these important issues. I mean, it's not just academics who apply, but of course, those who are working on the ground are encouraged to do so. So that's my plug for that prize. That philanthropist has put in a lot of money for that. So I think it's important to do that. And we had promised that we would, wouldn't we? So that's what I'm doing now. I left ICC Politics back in 2006. And is there a heater on in here? It's really warm. I can hear something. You know, I'm always warm, but it's super warm in here with all these bodies emitting all this energy. And maybe that's part of the problem of permafrost melt, right? But I left elected politics in 2006, and I have carried on as an independent because for me it wasn't an issue of being elected or the work that I feel is really important to our world in the North and to the world as a whole goes well beyond, elected positions for me. And so I've been able to keep rather busy on sharing and with audiences around the world on these issues. And as we know, the world certainly has become increasingly aware of the Arctic now, and it's become, an issue in the forefront of everybody's minds for all kinds of reasons. But of course, the big issue, of course, has been climatic changes in the Arctic, and as that melts, it affects other people in the world. And again, that issue of connectivity, which is so very important. But also now, of course, is this whole issue of economics. The world is really keenly wanting to tap into the rich resources that lie beneath that melting ice and, of course, the melting permafrost that is happening up in the Arctic. So I think it has, become an issue for global policy leaders around the world and makers and researchers, and of course, big companies that are very keen on coming in. And I'm not dogmatic about things, but I think people know where I stand in terms of being cautious about development as it relates to the protection of a way of life and our environment. And so the message that I want to share with you this evening, as I always do everywhere, and I hope those who heard me in Whitehorse, like Norma Cassie, my friend who I've worked with around the world for many years, and of course Joanne, it's Joanne, right? Oh, I hope I get this right. I meet so many people, and it's just wonderful to see you again as well. And I hope I'm not going to bore you guys, because the core message of what I give around the world is basically the same, but I try to tailor it so that, each and every one of you who are working on important issues are also validated in some of the talks that I give. And so I try to make these issues of connectivity a big one in those terms, and how your roles are very much connected to everything that everyone else is doing in terms of trying to translate that science and the research that you do into national and international policy. And there has been evidence of how that works so well. I mean, the work that I've done on the POPs Treaty, the persistent organic pollutants and toxins issue, is one that is a great example of that, of how we were able to take that research that has always been connected and collaborated with traditional knowledge into international policy. So it can be done, and I've witnessed it everywhere in that I have been doing over the years. And so that issue, again, as I say, the endeavor of connectivity here, and the endeavor that you're doing now in bringing together the three territories is really key, and it's really important, because I've seen in the work that I do, and having lived in Iqaluit for 13 years, I've recently just moved to Montreal for the next 2 or 3 years as I get ready to launch the book, but it's easy enough in some regions when you don't see the evidence as clearly, or are not living that evidence of climatic changes and permafrost melt and so on, to be buried in the sand, so to speak, to have your head in the sand and say, well, it's not that serious. You know, after all, we've had 2 really cold winters, you know, but not looking at the larger trends and not looking at the other regions that are even struggling harder than you are in other regions. And so for me, I was just completely ecstatic when Colleen called and said, we're having a pan-territorial workshops on permafrost. Could you come and give a keynote? And I was just absolutely thrilled to hear that, just to begin with, that the 3 territories were coming together to do this work, because I think it's so important that the partnership issue is important, but it's also to ensure that every region or every territory is educating one another on the seriousness of the matter, because it isn't always evident in certain places, although there is that larger trend, as we all know, that's happening. You're working on these very foundational issues here. You know, we hear a lot about the ice, and it's an important piece, certainly, in our culture, and it's a real important piece in all around environmentally as a disastrous issue, an environmental disaster. But it's the foundational challenges that, you know, you're at the core. The work that you're doing is at the very core of what is giving rise to this influx of industry coming in to really develop, you know, the geological and ecological riches that we've inherited in the north. So it's easy. And it's much easier for mining and extractive industries to get to those riches now as the permafrost melts. So I think you're working on the core of what it means for the North and Arctic homelands as we're faced with these, in terms of losing, you know, don't mind the pun, but losing the solidity of that foundation of our land. And that's huge work that you're doing. So it certainly is appreciated for some of us who need that in order to try to change the mindsets of those nationally and internationally. And so while we've been reaching out to connect with the rest of the world to ask that they change their behavior, so I'm going back into kind of some policy stuff here, but so that we don't suffer those consequences in the north, we also have to be thinking about recognizing the many interconnections that exist today and will exist around the use of our own northern regions. That includes the oceans and the lands. We know that the Arctic has been subjected to just enormous and the most dramatic environmental effects of globalization. As I mentioned, the persistent organic pollutants, our weakened ozone layer, and most recently, of course, those big, huge changes of climate change. And we've, you know, borne the brunt of development far from home. So we've been very compelled through some of our international organizations to reach out to the world to tell them the story. But, and I know that this audience probably is even more aware of what is happening in the north and how dire things are getting in our regions with the melt of the permafrost, which is, of course, I again was reminded this morning as I sat in on the session and coming even by bus with Norma, sitting beside Norma tonight, and her telling that very clear story of, you know, what's happening with the lakes there where she comes from. We know, you know, it's all there, and I don't have to necessarily repeat, but we know the beach slumping, the sinking land that damages the buildings. And where I come from, where I was born in Nunavik, you know, we have places. Is there a Nunavik person here? I think I saw on the agenda that there might have been someone from Nunavik. But I know that in Nunavik, in Cloutier, for example, you know, homes have had to be already relocated as a result of the permafrost because of the buckling of the buildings and the homes, and now they're wondering, are they going to have to do that to the majority of the community now? I know from my circumpolar work in Alaska, you just have to look at Shishmaref and Kavalina and Newtok and know that already the homes are in the sea as a result of beach slumping and all that's happening there. So when you work on those issues with a bird's eye view in that sense, because I've been blessed to have been working on the circumpolar issues with that view of the 4 countries where we Inuit live, then you have that incredible privilege and then a responsibility to continue to get people to see the larger picture of what's happening in the circumpolar world. And so all of these things that combined, are just escalating, as we know. And I'm not going to get into too much of the detail of that because you're the experts on that, along with our traditional knowledge holders, which are our elders and seasoned hunters who are always out on the land. And so, but it helps. It certainly helps, in terms of the work that many of us are trying to do to go out there and change the mindset of people to have a better understanding of what is happening, because your work is so critical in that sense, where it allows us on the ground, because I've always said the hunters are the ground truthers, to use an astronaut's term. We are the ground truthers of that, what is happening. And we correlate these observations and confirm the observations made, whether it's, through data from far, even from space, or from the science that is happening. And with that kind of holistic understanding that we have, we know there has been changes happening for a long, long time now. And we place a great deal of value, as you know, if you've been working in our communities, on the ice and snow and what lies beneath it, because it's that platform that we're still so connected to in terms of the pursuit of the animals that we hunt for our families. And there is no price that you could pay for many of us to lose that platform. I mean, I know there's a big momentum going, and there's a big direction in terms of extractive industry and so on, but really we have to start thinking in terms of the value of that coal, the value of that permafrost, and the value of the ice. And we're starting to see that the world is going to start to shift and understand that value that we hold in the Arctic and the northern communities, because we know that the cooling system, as it breaks down, the air conditioner, if you will, is going to add a whole lot more to the budgets and to the finances and to the insurance, and you name it. It's just going to start to escalate more and more. And so people are starting to look at this as not as only just as a benefit to industry, but also very much so as a huge expense that is going to start to happen. And the case in point, of course, was a year ago now, I think it was, when Sandy hit. And people realized that started to cost the U.S. over $50 billion to revamp, the whole area that had been hit so hard. So these things will continue to happen. There's just no doubt about that. But again, I go back to the cooling system for the planet. As we know, the air conditioner is something that people are just starting to really grasp as a serious issue. So, as I said, we northern Indigenous peoples, Inuit and First Nations alike, are as I say, the ground truthers of global environmental change. We have been the ones to experience these rapid changes firsthand. There's no doubt. Whether it's the contaminants poisoning our country food, or the rapid climate change that has changed every fiber of our being and our communities and our lives as Indigenous peoples in the North. And for us, this is not just environmental issues. These are first and foremost, most cases, health issues. Health of individuals, health of families, health of our communities, health of our environment, and of course the health of our wildlife. And when I was the president of ICC Canada, under the international body of the ICC, and of course with the ITK, which is the Inuit Teperit of Canada, or Teperit of Canada, along with many government departments, which includes Health Canada, Environment Canada, and Industry Canada, to name a few, we were able to change the course of a very alarming issue of persistent organic pollutants and come to a very successful Stockholm Convention. And some of you may be up to speed on some of that because as researchers you probably made some of those connections in those years, which now makes some of our country foods safer. So changing, again, it's that story of being able to take what you research together with our own scientists in their own right, our Inuit scientists in their own right, to be able to translate that is huge. We showed the human face to a very chemical story. We didn't work just as Inuit alone. We worked with fellow Aboriginal peoples of this country. We worked with the Athabascans, with the Gwich'in, with the Dene, with the Métis, and we created a coalition. And I became the spokesperson for that coalition, but we worked very closely together internationally. And together we were able to achieve a great feat of not only using the human face to this issue, but we were able to translate that that data and that policy, the research into international policy. And it shows how important your work on permafrost is in building that rich data, which, again, I can't stress enough. And maybe I'm overstressing at this point, but I think it's important to note that sometimes one may think that the work that you're doing doesn't have an effect around you, but in reality, for many policymakers, it really does have a great effect in the long run for the larger picture. So here we were, and I like to walk people through the real human aspect of the situation in our communities from maybe a little bit of a different angle than what you might be used to hearing, because I think it's important to put these things into context, because sometimes researchers can make the mistake of coming in just like the geese, in the spring and leave in the fall. And it's important, I think, for researchers to kind of see and hear from the perspective of an Inuk who's lived through changes, to kind of just, when you're out there, just to kind of remember certain things. And I hope that you can pick up and resonate with some of that and say, oh, I never thought of it that way. And I just hope that you see that as a positive in that way. So bear with me as I walk you through the Inuit journey for the next little while. We were highly an independent people. I mean, I grew up traveling only by dog team the first 10 years of my life. I spoke no English until I was 6 years old. And then, of course, very quickly at the age of 10 was sent away for school and didn't see Christmas for winter at home for 5 years. And then by the time I got home, the dogs were gone. And nobody spoke about these issues of the dogs. Why did they go? And as a teenager coming home, you don't really know what happened because people don't talk. But of course, now we know that there's been a whole, what we consider and call and name historical traumas that were happening throughout the 50s, 60s, 70s. And one of them was the dog slaughters. But we had our own systems in place. And I remember it in my own lifetime. We had a remarkable way in which we taught our children for the opportunities and challenges of life. We had our own education, justice systems in a sense, health, social, based on Indigenous knowledge and wisdom. And we really prepared our young for the challenges and opportunities of life in a very holistic way. And then things started to happen very quickly. These challenges, then brought about changes that we were not able to keep up with. And of course, that made us lose our sense of self and our sense of personal powers. And it led to all kinds of situations that we're now faced with, and that's being highly dependent on substances, on institutions and processes. And a lot of these historical traumas, of course, have led to the erosion of our sense of self-worth, our sense of identity, and help to lessen our ability to make and think and act for ourselves. And so this in turn has translated into the monumental health and social challenges that our peoples are facing today, and which all too often, unfortunately, is misinterpreted as our inability to adapt to a modern world. And that couldn't be further from the truth. We're very adaptable people. In fact, our culture is based on being able to adapt well. And so we should realize that these kinds of substance abuse issues, the health problems, and of course the most distressing of all, many of our young people taking their own lives, is not the natural states of our people. And through it all, we've always had our land. We had the very predictable environment at the time and climate, and the wisdom of our hunters and our elders to lead us through any kind of crisis. And we had that wisdom to help us to adapt. But things are not so predictable today. Dramatic changes caused by greenhouse gases, as we know, has just really been a challenge on every single front of our lives. And it does threaten our very culture and our very ability to live off the land, to eat our country food, which is, of course, the most important thing to us. Norma gave me a bag of nikku the other day from her caribou porcupine, or her porcupine caribou herd from her region. And when I got home, you know, it was just one of those special gifts that one gets. We're very connected to our country food. And I was telling her tonight that I had it with some seal meat. So the porcupine caribou and the seal of Nunavut met in my tummy. And it was yummy, believe me. And so we put a lot of incredible strength into our connection with country food across this country, as you all know. So, and also, of course, the meaning of ice. You know, you can't forget that nowhere else in the world does ice and snow represent transportation and mobility as it does for us in the Arctic. And when that starts to go, then it becomes an issue of safety and security first and foremost. So in all of the regions where we live, we know we're dealing with extreme coastal erosion, the melting permafrost, the rapid runoffs, and even though there's been, you know, cold winters lately, of course the trends are there. We know that. There's new species that come into play. We know that. So in light of all of those things that were happening, and I'll walk you through because perhaps you haven't heard this, you know, certainly you haven't heard it personally from me, and some of you who worked with me have, is the launching of the human rights petition that I launched globally back in 2005. And so in light of that threat of climate change posing on our traditional way of life, 62 Inuit hunters from Alaska and from Canada, and I led the campaign. We launched a human rights petition against the United States using the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. And it took us 2 years of preparation because I felt at the time in a leadership role, it was really important to get the world to take notice, and particularly the United States, that was always the odd man out in these negotiations. And they were certainly fighting tooth and nail not to have a strong Arctic climate impact assessment that had policy recommendations attached to it. And if anybody was ever involved in that work and that process, you'll know just how tough that was to try to get the ACIA out there to use traditional knowledge in every chapter and to really push for policy recommendations that would allow these 8 countries, you know, powerful countries in the Arctic where we all live, to ensure that they were going to adhere to the policy recommendations, and that would be to start to lower greenhouse gas emissions in their countries. And so the petition certainly caught the world's attention, and I think it did forever change the dialogue on climate change as a human rights issue. And although at the end of the day, the Commission didn't hear our particular Inuit petition, they were able to take my testimony along with the legal counsel that I had at the time to go down and allow them to see the connections between climate change and human rights as a legal issue. And so in that sense, we helped to change the discourse on this issue as just a greenhouse gas emissions problem, just like we did with the POPs Treaty being just a chemical story to one of a human story. And I think it's so important for us to continue to keep that human face on these issues that are so important to all of us in not just in the North, but in the world. And as we know, the health impacts of these changes for Inuit communities are profound. We continue to really rely on our traditional subsistence food, and already, though climate change has already started to change the migration and quality of our animals as well in so many ways. And it makes it even harder for us to hunt and less safe to eat at times. And when I speak about these issues, again, it's coming from that circumpolar perspective. It's the 4 countries, you know. We may never have heard of these in some communities where people had to really think twice about when to go out and hunt because it was unsafe. But in many places, this is the case today. Hunting and gathering itself has been affected with very shorter periods of these safe frozen ice and snow, which means less traveling in some areas. And the unpredictability of the weather, of course, and more accidents that are happening. More losses amongst our hunters is happening as well. And more and more of our hunters, in fact, are having to be rescued as a result. So with less traditional food sometimes arriving, of course, then we're stressed already with a very high cost of living. The human faces are coming up now, which are my favorite. The cost of living, of course, then makes it even harder for us to shift away, you know, from our traditional food to more southern diets, which is proving, of course, far less healthy. And we have higher rates of diabetes and food-related illnesses in Canada now as well, as we know. And reliance on southern imports only deepens that reliance on government support, which we are trying so hard, you know, to try to make a culture match in this new world order of globalization that is hitting us so hard. And which really, you know, becoming reliant is the opposite of building sustainable communities, thriving local economies that heavily incorporate the elements of our culture, and that's what we're trying to do. So, and we've learned that our children have better chances to choose a healthier way of life if they do remain, you know, connected to our culture and to our principles and values. And again, as I say, you know, we've come from a very fast, rapid change that has happened in our world. You know, and we are a very uniquely adaptable peoples in the Arctic, in the north, and I speak from the Inuit perspective, but I know that my fellow Aboriginal peoples of this country certainly relate to what I'm saying here. So these enormous changes to our communities are certainly not without consequences. Again, much of the loss of the control that we've had in our lives added to those historical traumas in a short period of time, which includes, in our case, the forced relocations, many children being uprooted from their families and culture to be deprogrammed and in order to be reprogrammed, and I'm part of that era. The dog slaughters that happened during that period of time in the 60s when I was away for those 5 years and then didn't know what had happened, only to find out today there's just this huge there has been now already commissions that have been set up to look at that, inquiries, you know, about that in Nunavik and Nunavut, and you can't deny that it didn't happen, although there seems to be still not a clear situation there. And then there was the sexual abuse from all those in authority. There was the collapse of the sealskin market, where Bridget Bardot single-handedly came over in the 60s and just wiped out the commercial hunt, and along with it ours with the broad stroke. And again, here we are still facing the same kind of emotionally driven ways in which animal rights people come in and not look at this. Although I hear we have a chef now on our side. Have you read that? There's some renowned chef that is now saying, no, don't use the broad stroke with the Inuit of the Arctic, you know, which is quite good. But there has to be more of that. But together, all of these, and now, of course, the environmental changes that we've been faced with. And so all of these together have created a very deep wound in our collective community and has come out as collective pain in all of our communities. And again, as I say, through it all, we had all of these, our culture to keep us going. And now here we are, you know, faced with issues of food security, you know, which, again, you can't separate and silo all these pieces. You have to be able to see them as a whole in order to try to move in a direction that allows us to see things holistically, because the Inuit tradition of hunting is really holistic in the sense that it teaches your children how to build their own character as well as being proficient providers and hunters. The process of the hunt really does teach our children to be patient, to be bold under pressure, to withstand stress, to not be how do you call that? Not compulsive, but impulsive. And we're seeing that impulsivity, there's a real connection there sometimes to suicides as well. That if you didn't learn that, how not to be impulsive on the land, because when you're being impulsive on the land, you're putting yourself and your family and those around you at risk. But if you have learned to integrate those kinds of character building, which come naturally in a hunting culture out on the land, then you can transfer that and integrate that into the modern world. And so we're learning about some of the strengths of a hunting culture is really important in that sense. And you learn to be reflective, you learn to be very focused, and you learn to withstand stress. But ultimately, you're learning to have sound judgment and wisdom. And that is what a hunting culture does. And that is really what Indigenous peoples do around the world when you're connected on a day-to-day basis with your heritage and your culture. And oftentimes these kinds of learning, the holistic way in which Aboriginal peoples teach their children traditionally, is not brought into an education system, an institutional way of learning, for example. And the academic and technical way of learning in a school is often very separated from the character building and never reassembled anywhere else. And so it becomes rather difficult for us to embrace sometimes the education systems that aren't working for us, because traditionally that was, and parents can't seem to relate to that always, because that's not how traditionally we taught our children in a very holistic manner. And so that's why climate change for us is not just an issue of our environment. It's also an issue of our health and our rights and our ability to exist as an Indigenous people. But precisely those rights are being very challenged and minimized by the unpredictability of our climate. And as traveling and hunting on the land becomes more dangerous, then there's less of that ability for that rich experience for our young people to learn about themselves. Because the technical aspect of a hunt is how the world works. But the character building process of the hunt is how you work. And our children need to know how they work in those terms. And we really have to think hard about what is being lost here with the ice, the permafrost, and our way of life that was so very holistic in trying to prepare our children for the incredibly harsh, what is considered to be the harshest environment in the world. And so it's more than that. And so we're trying to cope with the stressors that accompanied the first wave of a lot of these tumultuous changes. And it's now well understood that these stressors translate into what we witness today with our social and health challenges in our community. And the more unexpected, unpredictable stressors that come with these climatic changes and the rapid influx of development, this will only add to the situations we're already grappling with. So as I said, a week or two ago when I was in Whitehorse, and there was a lot of audience of the mining companies that were there, I said, we've got to get this right. If you're going to come in, already we have a lot of institutions that are service institutions like our health, our judicial, which should be quite benign actually, but they haven't fared well in our communities, and they're considered helpful institutions. So you can well imagine what is considered to be highly intrusive, such as the mining industry, are going to have to get it really right, because they're going to have to reinvent themselves really well and really differently. And are they going to be able to do that? I don't know. I have a lot of questions about that. I'm not suggesting that I'm completely anti-development, but I'm suggesting that we have to be very cautious about a lot of these things, because we are already in a very vulnerable state. And I don't want to focus just on the negative. So I think it's important that we, I walk people through that so that you can really feel the human aspect to climate change and to the changes that are happening in our communities. So my work on persistent organic pollutants and in connecting human rights to climate change has been focusing on this very holistically and ensuring that the human faces of this issue are in the minds of policy makers when we're discussing how to address them. And it's very unfortunate, but we live in a country and a situation today where our own governments, whether at the international level, are not doing enough yet to address these issues. And in fact, perhaps some of you have been part of the situation where the funding has been cut, where you're not able to speak publicly about some of your findings and so on. And so I think all the more with all that's happening with government policies in our own country and in some other larger countries as well that have power, we need to continue to keep focusing these issues as a real human issue and a human rights issue. And I think a rights-based human approach is the solution. And I'm very big on promoting that approach around the world. Because I think there's a lesson here for all of us who are involved in trying to make it a better world here in the North. Because the language of technology and economics is always going to call for further delay. You know, governments are always going to say we need to be more certain about this, or we're going to lose jobs. It's going to be bad for our economy. It's always going to be that way. But I think if we reframe this debate in terms of fundamental human rights and the connections between environmental change and cultural rights, it refocuses the debate on humanity and not just economy. And so because the world has not fully yet really responded to our voices. And certainly with what's been happening with some of the current policies in addressing science, in addressing, you know, the needs of our communities in a big way other than just that one-track mind that seems to be happening now, we need to really come together as partners in all that we're doing in addressing what is happening in the North. And the North being that health barometer for the rest of the planet. Not because the North wants to be insular, not because it wants to be all by itself saying we have the problems or we hold all the solutions, but because the North and the Arctic is that health barometer for the rest of the planet. As I say, it is, after all, that air conditioner for the rest of the planet, and it's breaking down. And that connection is really clear for me when I go to the Many Strong Voices meetings, which is a program that I helped to launch in 2005, the same time that I was launching the human rights petition under the United Nations Environment Program, where the North, who were being most impacted, and the South, the small island developing states, are sinking as a result of the melting of the Arctic. And I felt very strongly that there needs to be some kind of a program or a partnership in working with the vulnerable peoples of the world that are being very negatively impacted by climatic changes. And so the Many Strong Voices, funding of course always is an issue, and I think they're grappling with that right now, but certainly it really, you really can't deny when you see the actual images of what's happening in Alaska and many other parts of the North, and the small island developing states that are sinking, where their homes are literally already, you know, living so close to sea level, are impacted. And so we, you know, we need to keep the northern cultures involved. We can't be simply window dressing to any of these situations with government or with companies who control a lot of the decisions that are happening, not just in our country, but even internationally. And I think informing these kinds of positions, northern cultures must be part of that, very much a broad-based principle rethinking with our national approach. And so we must reframe, I think, the terms of the debate over climate action. Again, as I say, there's always a way that the language of economics and technology are always going to call for more delay and more certainty. You know, is it really happening? And what happens, of course, this approach tends to silo, and it really separates these issues from one another, as opposed to recognizing the connections between rights between environment, between health, economies, and society. And ultimately, I think addressing climate change in the language of human rights and building those human rights protections in our global climate agreements are more than just strategic choices. They are ethical imperatives that really demand the world retake a principled path and courageously reconnect to solve this great challenge that we have. And just very briefly, as I start to wind down, I want to identify some of the lapses because I believe from that kind of adversity and challenge we can find ourselves and really remain true to ourselves as we try to find that principled path that I talk about, which in turn provides that power of leadership, I think, not just here in the Canadian North, but throughout the circumpolar world and even the world as a whole. And the backdrop of what we're now facing across our country and in the North is now quite different from just a few years ago, if you recall. You know, there was a lot, Norma and I talked about this a little bit, where there just seems to be this big machinery coming in and it's all going in that one direction, where there used to be those diverse voices of people working together to do the right thing and people really putting stewardship of the land, you know, first and foremost, and really working hard to ensure that culture was being protected, environment was at the forefront of all of the talks that were happening in our country and beyond. And I remember, you know, I gave a lecture a few years ago in Iqaluit, just a few years ago, a public lecture, the Baldwin LaFontaine lecture that was hosted by John Rosten-Saul. And I tried to signal to our own communities as well at the time what I meant by that. And so I just want to very quickly quote what I was saying at the time. And I say, I quote, "As wise stewards of our land, I would urge my own people to refuse the dangerous compromises between our principles and development that might diminish our own moral standing and claim to high ground as Indigenous peoples. And as we call on the world to change its ecologically degrading practices, we must not accept those practices at home, no matter how desperate our needs are for economic development. Economic gain must not override the existence and well-being of a whole people whose way of life is already being severely taxed, and we must not let the prospect of development in the Arctic diminish our ability and our region's ability to teach the life-centered sustainability that Arctic peoples have practiced for millennia. The people whose lives depend on the ice and snow for cultural survival must be a central component of all of our plans, and we must not permit the discussion of northern development be conducted only in terms of sovereignty, resources, and economies. The focus must be on the human dimension, the human communities, and the protection of human cultural rights. We cannot separate political and economic development in our communities from the education, health, and well-being of individuals and families," end quote. And so every level of, you know, the governance system here in the North, throughout, I believe, must be mobilized to ensure that Indigenous knowledge and wisdom is the foundation of sustainable economic endeavor. And we were, as I said, we were once a very highly independent people with our own systems in place. And I believe we can return to that sustainable cultural system again. But we must do so by breaking away from the cycles of dependency, the struggles that we face at the social level, the addictions, all of those. And because much of the root of the challenges that we face as a result of dependencies, which add to the erosion, as I say, to that sense of identity and self-worth, and our inability that we've lost to think and act for ourselves, really does translate into all the health issues that we're faced with. And it really, you know, including mental health, social challenges that really are misunderstood and not well understood in that way. We are a people who continue to be marginalized and groomed towards a lot of dispiritedness, and the violence in our communities are reflective of that. We're not a violent people. And just as important, I think the activities we're concerned about are the important alternatives. We have to start thinking in terms of how do we build really eco-friendly way of sustainability for economic development. as the world is now starting to shift towards a different way of alternative and renewable energy, we've got to start making those plans for ourselves too in the Arctic. It's really important we do that. And there's all kinds of ways in which that can happen. And when I was in Whitehorse, I was given a book called Arctic Power. And so that I know that that's starting to happen in many regions of this country, in the Aboriginal lands, and that's so important to continue to foster that as well, because I worry that if we put all of our eggs into that basket, whether it's resource extraction or oil and gas development, while the rest of the world is looking to wean itself off of the unsustainable way, then we're going to be left in the dust again. For years now, we have been cleaning up the mess of past military sites and the dew lines and so on. And, I fear that the rest of the world will be on its way in 20, 30 years from now, and here we'll be because we chose an unsustainable way. How ironic would that be, that we got on that bandwagon of a very unsustainable way of doing, and then we're left with the mess in 20, 30 years when all of these resources are gone. And so I think it just really, we just have to think a lot of these things through in terms of development. And so I think it's now time for all of us to be reframing and rethinking about some of these things, because for me, I think it's a moral issue. For me, it's a real moral issue where we've been asking the world to stop causing harm to our way of life, and that excuse of not being able to do that, because when I would ask the question, you have to stop bringing harm to a way of life when you consciously know what's happening, and the response would be, but it costs too much for us to stop bringing harm to your way of life. And so that can't be the answer anymore. That cannot be the response that we get, because we have to start thinking in terms of, the principled path that the world has to come on now. And on this note of ethics, values, and principles, we've been able to maintain our own moral compass by really relying on our ancient sense of principles that have sustained us for millennia. So I think everything we do now has to be focused on that way of life and the way in which we have been able to live sustainably for millennia. So our strength stems not only from our values and our principles, but the ingenuity of Aboriginal cultures, the ingenuity in knowing how to live sustainably, that we can serve as that model for so many communities and the nation. So we have to resist, I think, in ending the urge to compromise our values and lose our high moral ground by adopting quick fixes to the economic and social problems that we're faced with, because our influence really does spring from our ethical authority. And once we've lost that moral high ground, our sense of accountability to a sustainable Arctic, it's going to be a really hard trek to come back to that. So let's do it together. Let's do it together as scientists and as our own scientists in their own right in our communities, so with the traditional knowledge that is so rich and needs to be tapped into more and needs to be respected. And I think it's about understanding and recognizing one another in the roles that we have to play in all of the challenges that our environment in the Arctic is going through. So again, thank you very much for having me here. It's been a real honor to be back up here with kindred spirits from all walks of life. And I thank you, Nakomi Mareluk, for having me here. Good evening.